Well, thank you very much, everyone. I'm really pleased to be here. This is, I think, my first talk in Canada. And if I fail to make it back across the border, I guess I'll be giving a lot more talks in Canada. But let's keep our fingers crossed on that one. I also want to say at the outset that I'm not a technologist. As you heard, I am a lawyer. I'm a civil rights attorney. I have been representing large and small tech companies at the beginning of my career, and so I've been able to crack the black box a little bit, at an early stage, right after the first .com bust. But I'm also coming at these issues as an advocate, right? So, as you know, as I hope you know, the ACLU is the United States' oldest and longest-standing organization that's entirely dedicated to protecting constitutional rights and liberties. So that's really the lens that I'm coming at this from. I know that there will be lots of folks from tech companies in the room. I welcome the dialogue, and as you'll see, I think having the civil liberties and fairness dialogue inside tech companies is a really, really important thing. So I'm going to do a little bit of sort of stage setting, talk to you about what the problem is that I am really intending to address. Talk about kind of how it's played out. There's sort of growing bodies of research around fairness in technology, and then try to apply it to some real-world examples. And we are advocating on all kinds of issues that involve tech and liberty right now. So this is by no means exhaustive. This is really just a very, very, very tiny sliver of the space within constitutional rights and liberties to which some of these questions and principles could be applied. So let's get cracking. I also want to say, by the way, thank you for sticking around. I was half thinking that I would be talking to my panel chair, and there would maybe be one other person, and we'd have an intimate discussion. But I'm glad you all are around, and I think it shows that there's a real hunger in tech communities for this kind of a conversation. So what is the conversation we're talking about? For me, we're really talking about how advancing technology and data flows impact the most vulnerable communities, right? That they change the civil liberties game for everybody. We are rapidly approaching this new world, as you probably know, in which discretion and control over data is being transferred from traditional government actors into the private sector, right? The private sector has this massive amount of timely data that gives it a tremendous amount of power. Data is power, right? And as a civil liberties attorney, I have been used to being able to go after government actors, right, which have certain mechanisms of transparency that are inherently attached to them. So we can use constitutional and statutory mechanisms to go after those government actors. And unfortunately, that system, I think, it starts to break down where that discretion is transferred into the private sector. There's now a body of research that's just starting to explore these issues, but frankly, I've been somewhat surprised at how diffuse within the tech sector itself, within the folks who are technologists who actually work within these companies, that conversation is really happening, if at all, in a very diffuse and not coherent manner. I also want to note, by the way, that my talk is really premised on the United States constitutional and statutory framework, but you can take the principles and apply them elsewhere as well. So when we look at what the scope of the problem is, we often talk about, right, the public discourse on information security. There's sort of this weird conflation of privacy and security as if those things were the same thing. There's this check-the-box approach to compliance on security, and it's thought that that's a conversation about fairness, but it's really not. Elon Musk will talk to you about the robot overlords that are coming to rule all of us, but that's not really the conversation I'm the most worried about at this point. Really, what I'm talking about is undermining this notion that technology is actually neutral, right? We're being sold this vision that technology is going to solve our problems, that it's a neutral thing. But the flip side is really that we're coming to a world where control over your data means we may end up in a two-tier society where technology is a way not to solve, but to actually reinforce many of the biases that already exist in every sector of our economy and all kinds of fields in our country. And again, statutory protections will matter less, and bias will be harder to challenge because it will be relocated from the purview of these individual actors into the black box inside algorithms which are located inside the technology sector and are harder to get at and challenge. So very briefly, you all are techies. I don't really need to explain this to you. You hemorrhage data in all kinds of spaces, right? You all have one of these. If you read the terms of service on the 100 apps that you have on this on day 1, I bet you didn't do it on day 2 or day 3 or day 10 or every time you use the app, but maybe you should, right? Because they are always changing. You're hemorrhaging data through that. There is ubiquitous location tracking. Your bus pass tracks you. License plate readers track you. You interact with websites whose business model is really monetizing your data. And then there's myriad government and private surveillance on top of that. So lots and lots of data. And guess what? Everyone wants your data, right? Private businesses, government entities, other individuals. And that has an impact on the transparency and control over which you can exercise over that data, where the data can be used by businesses, it can be sold to data brokers, it can be used by public entities, it can become the basis for the development of predictive metrics. And generally speaking, when you sign up for your free flashlight app, you're not necessarily thinking that your data is going to be used for all of those things. And of course, a lot of this will be happening without your even knowing it. So in addition to the fairness question, there's also a basic transparency question of what the consumer even knows is happening to that data. So very briefly, I'm going to talk about what I call the 4 game changers. And these are really the 4 reasons why I think data hemorrhaging matters quite a bit. The first game changer is just aggregation, right? Over the years, we have sort of relied de facto on this idea that different pieces of data don't actually meet each other, right? For example, back in the day when law enforcement agencies used to keep dossiers on people, data would literally live in filing cabinets, right? There would be agency A, agency B, never the twain shall meet. Even more recently, where data was computerized, we had systems that didn't really talk to each other, right? So those 2 pieces of data never met each other. Now, systems are deliberately being built to break down silos. The California predictive policing company Palantir has an entire business model that's premised on this idea that we are going to break down the silos, and in fact, we're going to put so much data together in one place that is going to be prohibitive for any single law enforcement agency to opt out of trying to access that data. So it turns into the snowball effect that's really driven in the first place by connecting these systems together. And of course, aggregation also amplifies the problem of bad data, right? Because when one piece of bad data meets another piece of bad data, the sum is actually greater than the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. That's the metaphor I'm looking for. Analytics, of course, you all are techies again, so you know that the science of the inferences you can draw from a given data set is always growing, right? I think of it almost like DNA, right? There used to be entire sections of our DNA that we thought were just junk. Guess what? There's actually valuable data encoded on those fields as well. A corollary to this, of course, is that re-identifying data, even data that has been purportedly anonymized, gets easier and easier down the line. And frankly, it often doesn't even take particularly sophisticated analytics. There's a person who was able to re-identify 43% of hospital files, basically, to individual patients just by doing a newspaper search for who was hospitalized. That's pretty good, 43% for a supposedly anonymized set of data that was sensitive and related to someone's healthcare. Game changer 3, predictive metrics. All right, so this is where the game really starts to get interesting. These are algorithms that tell you not only about what is, but what might be. And as it turns out, people who are not technically sophisticated, they've studied this, are very, very willing to believe that predictive technologies are far more accurate than they actually are, right? So even decisions that perhaps would seem ridiculous coming from a human being, if they're validated by an algorithm and come out of a machine, are seen to be more reliable. A good example of something that's happening in this field is predictive policing and predictive sentencing. Palantir again, right, where these tools are supposed to tell you where crime will happen and who might commit crime. These tools are generally unaccountable, right? They come out of a black box where they may be based on metrics like someone's criminal history, someone's neighborhood, someone's associations. Of course, they may be based on potentially unconstitutional bases, such as someone's race or gender, which again, as a civil rights attorney, that's a problem for me because it makes it difficult to challenge. And they may be even based on objectively irrational metrics like someone's love of curly fries, right? I'm not making up the curly fries. Some of you may have actually seen that study, which looked at people's online behavior and determined that the best predictors of high intelligence included something like thunderstorms, the Colbert Report, and curly fries. So these metrics, they're objectively irrational, right? And yet we have no way right now of cracking open the black box to determine the basis of a tool that really is having this huge impact on how communities are policed, who gets stopped, who gets searched, who gets arrested, who gets sentenced, how long their sentence is, when they get out, and what happens to them after that. So these are the kinds of challenges that we're seeing around predictive metrics. And then finally, machine learning, game changer number 4. Things get even more interesting because, as you know, the premise of machine learning is an algorithm that changes the basis of its decision-making based on the data sets that it learns. Here, even the creators of that machine learning system cannot tell you how that tool is making decisions, right? On day 1, its decision-making algorithm will be different from what it is on day 10 or day 50. The corollary to that is that rooting out discrimination, biased impacts, actually becomes a moving target where you almost have to continuously test for disparate outcomes based on how you see the machine changing its output. A really simple but celebrated example was the machine learning tool that rated Mexican restaurants lower systematically than other restaurants, right? Just thought they were bad restaurants. Why did it think that? Because it learned from the internet that Mexican was bad. Now, that probably doesn't have a lot of bearing on whether the Mexican restaurants involved were good or bad, right? But as it turns out, this was a relatively easy thing for the creators to spot and fix. It's not always going to be that easy. Another interesting corollary of machine learning as well is that in some ways it sort of obviates the protections that we put on dissemination of data, right? So think about, for example, the FCC rules around internet service providers being blocked from monetizing your data that they come in contact with as part of them providing you the service of internet access, right? So those rules went away at the federal level. Many states jumped in to try to put rules in place that replaced those federal rules. That, by the way, never actually went into effect. And one of the compromises that was floated in a lot of states was, we'll let you, ISPs, use this data, but you can't further disseminate it. Well, guess what? if these ISPs are using that data set to be fed into machine learning systems, in some ways, that tool has absorbed that data set, right? And so it doesn't really matter all that much. I mean, it does matter, but it matters less if you put protections on further dissemination of the data set itself, if that company can simply turn around and sell the machine learning tool. So those are the game changers. And guess what? Ta-da! Here's someone's fancy graphic about the society where I think we're going. You can pay to protect your privacy if you're rich, if you're savvy. You can build a VPN. You can use Tor. But you have to have the savvy and the wherewithal to do that. And of course, as we know, from already having seen a digital divide that's pervasive over robust and pervasive over decades, it's very, very difficult to overcome that lack of savvy and lack of resources to equalize the gaps that we're trying to point out. I want to spend a moment talking about what they're finding in this growing field, this growing literature around bias in artificial intelligence, which you can really kind of read as sort of bias in how technologies are produced. Of course, the sort of truism here is that the tool is really as good as the data set that goes in. It's as good as the assumptions of the people that build the tool. And it's as good as the ways in which the tool is deployed in the real world. People impacted often don't play a role in the design of the tools. It's often, with no offense intended, Asian and white males under 40 that are creating these tools. And that may result in less attention to making the tools accurate for certain demographics or ethnicities. You see the graphic here about webcams and facial rec being less accurate for some ethnic groups. AI research has generally been technical. As I mentioned, there is this growing body of AI bias research. There hasn't been a ton of it, but it's quite telling because it seems like almost everywhere they look for bias, they find it, which suggests to me that there probably is, there's probably more out there. There's also this question of differential data and infrastructure resources. AI is just data intensive, right? It's expensive. And so communities that have fewer resources may be less able to access those tools. There really are no professional codes of ethics. And more to the point, we also don't really know how to quantify the disparities we do find in the ways these tools are deployed. These what you see up on the screen are just a few sort of real-world examples of where an unknown and unseen database predictive tool is making a real impact on someone's life and potentially their civil liberties, right? So people of color who are disproportionately low income work night shifts. They drive to and from work with a group of people that are disproportionately coming back from parties, right? Because they drive late night. And so they get classed in this insurance pool with drunk drivers, and they have a higher car insurance rate. Third-party data is getting very good at telling me whether I'm sick, maybe sometimes before I even know it. You heard about Target predicting a girl being pregnant and sending materials to her family. How far you live from your job. Some of these predictive tools can actually rely on that as a metric for how long you'll stay at your job, and therefore make a recommendation that favors people who live closer into their jobs. And again, those people may be disproportionately not people of color. And black identifying names, again, you get different search results for those names as for others. All this is harder to challenge, as I've mentioned, because government entities, at least, we have public records acts and certain standards to which we can hold a government actor through the Constitution. But when you turn that lens on the private sector, where the data is going and where the tools are coming from, there are really significant barriers to transparency. So, for example, the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, right, CFAA, which makes it so that you're essentially committing a federal crime every time you attempt to research a tool online, but and potentially, arguably violate the terms of service of that tool. The DMCA, the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, is another one. Trade secret has really been this big offensive weapon that has been asserted, in my view, overbroadly by companies that are, of course, legitimately protecting their work product, right? I'm not arguing that we don't need incentives to innovate, but where that trade secret protection comes in conflict with the public's right to know how these kinds of decisions that would be held to certain standards of transparency if it were a government entity doing it, where those standards are undermined, I would argue we need to take another look at how the standards are being applied. The result, of course, is that the metrics themselves are unseen and the basis of the metrics is generally unknown. There have been some studies about how this plays out inside the private sector. A really interesting upcoming paper by a New York law professor named Ari Waldman kind of looks at how privacy is actually implemented in the private sector and finds this gap, right? So lawyers have a very check-the-box approach to privacy, right, which is really compliance, and it goes down to the lowest common denominator of the legal framework, which of course is not adequate because the frameworks themselves are not adequate, right? So that's problem number one. CPOs, your chief privacy officer, generally tends to have a very sort of rosy and ambitious view of the world, but as it turns out, that view of the world and that view of kind of going to consumer expectations of privacy is not usually shared by technologists, and the technologists tend to deprioritize building privacy and fairness into their tools. And then, this AI conversation, the AI bias, is another really missing element, I think, in how this is happening in the private sector. And finally, the elephant in the room, of course, is this idea that if a company exists to monetize your data, how is it going to be possible for them to also do it in a way that protects your privacy? Tough question. Another layer is government contracting, right? Where, at least in the US, these companies, these local governments have had their budgets cut over a period of years and years and years, to the point where I think they're really, really desperate to stretch their dollars. What they run into is this really aggressive marketing by companies that, in some cases, use the technology itself as a loss leader, right? They want to get the technology into the hands of, say, your local sheriff's office, and the condition, of course, is that they then get the data back from the back end of the tool. Good examples are body cameras, or there's a company called B12 on the southern border. You may have seen this Intercept article, which is basically creating this massive private database of iris scans. And that's really interesting, right? Because the larger the database is, the more it costs a local department not to opt in, not to pay for access to that database. So someone has called systems like this and like Palantir the Facebook of crime, right? Because it's where everybody is. And as a law enforcement agency, you kind of face this choice about whether you opt in or you watch everybody else get access to that private database. The federal government is another player in this that is very significant because these technologies are often driven by federal subsidies. Interestingly, the federal subsidies often don't include a transparency component. Quite the opposite, actually. It is extremely difficult, and we've tried, right? We've researched this quite a bit. It's very, very difficult to kind of follow the lines back up through of accountability through these various layers of federal grants, often laundered through state agencies like the Washington State Military Department, for example. And the end result often is that transparency is contracted away. The ACLU of Washington, my organization, has more than one case going on right now where we have tried to get a public entity to release details of a particular tool. So, for example, the Tacoma Police Department has used stingrays, which are cell site simulators, right? They hook up to your phone by pretending to be a cell tower, and obviously, there are constitutional questions about whether a search is being conducted, whether that tool can actually only connect to your phone, or is it really conducting an unconstitutional search of all of the other phones in the area. I think we're likely to argue the latter. But of course, in order to argue that, we first have to understand how the tool is being used. And yet, in this case, what had happened is that the local police department signed a non-disclosure agreement with the maker of the tool, a company called Harris Corporation. And when this public disclosure request came in, Harris Corporation swooped in with the backing of the federal government, which had also subsidized the tool. And everybody said, no, wait, you can't release any details of this tool. As a result of which, our ability to understand how the tool is being used is severely limited. And I would argue, in an instance where it's a question between the continued use of the tool and the basic transparency obligations under the Public Records Act to that local populace, that the latter should really prevail. And yet, that has often not been the case, although we are still continuing to fight that question. So guess what? Your data is doing all kinds of stuff, right? You don't know what your data is doing, but it's doing all kinds of things. It's happening everywhere. I mentioned the public hospital re-identifying data. I mentioned the target question. Wisconsin, where predictive sentencing is being deployed so that a gentleman got a high-risk sentence that was much longer than a similarly situated female individual. Chicago, where they have this tool whose basis is unidentified, trying to determine who's going to be at risk of committing violence. Other systems like the Beware system, which is another one of these threat scoring systems without a basis. This happens a lot more than what you might think. And again, can we actually get to the basis of how the tools are making decisions? I want to look at a few specific examples and then open it up to questions. Police body cameras is one that I've lived and breathed since police body cameras became a thing. I've been on these endless statewide and local task forces about them. I'm not going to get into the data about whether they're effective or not, other than to say that it's more complicated than you might think. But what I will say in terms of the technology itself is that TASER, which is now calling itself Axon in the context of body cameras, has a much bigger plan than really just selling your department body cameras, right? What they want to do is take all of the data, right, all of the body camera videos, to create predictive systems that will automate policing, right? So they don't want police officers to have to write police reports anymore, and they want these systems of artificial intelligence to be incorporated into the body camera itself in a way that can recognize and possibly predict threatening behavior. The challenge of basing that massive change to policing on body camera data is that policing data sets are often themselves biased, right? Because they reflect existing choices about which neighborhoods get policed, who fits the profile of a suspect, i.e. who the officer may choose to approach. They may reflect choices about tactics, when to de-escalate and when to use force, how resources are deployed. Of course, body camera video particularly is also often biased because it's usually recorded under rules that the police department wrote themselves, right? It's from the perspective of the officer. The officer may have a lot of discretion over when to record and not to record. And all of that goes into this and forms the bedrock of this future system of automated policing. So imagine a situation in which I am approached by a law enforcement officer wearing a body cam that incorporates facial recognition, right? So the officer may get suspect-based metrics that actually have to do with my criminal history or my social media posts, right, through these backends that companies like Palantir are creating, but they also might simply get a threat score, right? They might get a red alert, right, a flashing red light. If the officer then chooses to approach me with his or her gun drawn, and I react badly to that, guess what? It's become a self-fulfilling prophecy if the interaction then escalates. And after the fact, you know, if I'm injured in that interaction, I may have a harder time holding that officer accountable because the officer now has the defense of the machine made me do it, right? And this comes up again and again where even though these systems are purportedly supposed to improve public safety, often it's the case that they seem to reinforce biases and provide justifications for the kinds of tactics that the police were going to use anyway. And there are several papers about this in policing in particular where there are these sort of reinforcing feedback loops that tend to justify the tactics that police want to use. Immigration, you know, similar thing actually. Palantir, which is, you know, sort of turning into this behemoth in the policing space, is also turning into a behemoth in the immigration space. So again, their business model is really about breaking down silos, but in many of these instances, there's sort of this inherent conflict in the purpose, the underlying purpose of the tool. You know, there's some relatively innocuous uses that are stated, like we're going to use predictive metrics to dedupe, right, deduplicate police databases, which are notoriously duplicative. Not a bad thing necessarily, right? Although you could see challenges if it disproportionately impacts people with certain names, right? So there's questions around that. But the other purposes of the tools, I think, raise a lot more concerns, right? So often the tools are sold as a way to help police keep track of gang members. And not only may that be based on predictive metrics, but it may also be based on bad data. What we've seen a lot of is, and particularly in jurisdictions that don't have explicit standards, which is a lot of them, that there are many databases that simply contain information with no criminal predicate whatsoever, right? That you didn't have to have any reasonable suspicion that this person was going to commit a crime. You simply profile them, right? And one good example is databases of people's tattoos, right? And this idea that people's tattoos may be gang-related. This is something that Palantir has actively encouraged, right? So with the officers who are deployed on the street in places that use Palantir software, Palantir has basically said, here's an incident report, right? Every time you come in contact with a member of the public, get all this information. Often the officers themselves didn't even know why they were collecting the information. They just knew it went into the database. What kind of bicycle is this kid riding? What kind of tattoos does this kid have, right? And that goes into the database, again, with this idea that aggregation is going to allow more inferences and be able to predict who's associating with whom, potentially who's a gang member. In Palantir's immigration side case, it becomes even more challenging because immigration is a space where the rules and the constitutional rules are applied in a much looser way. Palantir's tool also connects to the CIA databases, right, and various other DOJ databases that previously weren't connected. And on top of that, they also now have a system called EDI, which is a mobile biometric system that ICE, the Immigration Enforcement Agency, has deployed. So immigration is particularly worrisome as well because it's often used as a justification to subject everyone, particularly along the southern border, to what we would say are unconstitutional searches within zones that are 100 miles from the border. So imagine a situation where you just have a checkpoint where, you know, because it's 100 miles from the border, Border Patrol is saying it's effectively a part of the border, where they're simply using this tool to iris scan everybody and put that back in the database. That rapidly starts to look like an unconstitutional system to us, but again, much harder to challenge. So I've mostly talked about these, this idea of forced data sharing. Other kinds of predictive tools, social media monitoring systems is one that we recently did a public disclosure request in Washington around. Lots and lots of jurisdictions are using them. They are actually marketed actively as a way to keep ahead of protesters. For example, in Baltimore, in the wake of Freddie Gray's death, there were protests, and this was marketed as a tool to be able to get ahead of that, and also to surveil Black Lives Matter. And you can see, right, why someone concerned with the First Amendment might also be concerned about sort of a broad overreach in tools like this. And of course, the problem is that the Constitution and the constitutional bounds around these tools haven't really been clearly established, right? Our Supreme Court in the US has said that technology can be a game changer, right? So if you attach a GPS tracker to someone's car, for example, it's not the same thing as simply following them around in a police cruiser. And yet, with social media monitoring systems, we don't exactly know where that line is. And in the interim, there's sort of fertile ground for these tools to be misused. I'm not going to go through the blow-by-blow of each of these examples. It's not limited to law enforcement, though, right? So smart meters, again, surveillance-capable infrastructure coming to your house if you're not careful, and likely with rules that don't necessarily restrict how that very personal data may be used or disseminated to a third party. Many kinds of government surveillance tools, many of which have been, in fact, used against activists, license plate readers in New York City, for example, used against people going to and from mosques for several years in the 20-aughts. And of course, this inherent entanglement of the private sector in helping the government collect this data as well. And on, right? So reproductive freedom, labor rights, all kinds of privacy issues that are compounded by the advancements of technology. Right? This is really everything we work on, and it's a way that may actually obviate the core of the protections that we have under our Constitution. So do we just give up and all go home and bury our heads in our hands? Hopefully not. So I'm going to leave you with just a few quick points on what I think we actually can do. Maybe the most important one is that we start to internalize and use a common language around the deployment of technology. So often when I'm interviewed about technology, they'll say, well, Shankar, do you think body cameras are a good or a bad thing? And I'll say, tell me what the rules are. Tell me why you're deploying them, what the purpose is. A body camera system that's deployed for purposes of police accountability only looks really different, right, from a body camera system that's deployed for the purpose of gathering evidence and prosecuting people. Very different purposes, and yet the fundamental step that most jurisdictions miss is to say what the tool is for in the first place. If you do that, you can then articulate the benefits of the technology as well as the impacts, right? So the costs aren't just the dollar costs, because again, often these tools are heavily subsidized or free, but it's the impact on civil liberties, it's the impact on community trust, right? Am I going to be willing to interact with an officer if I'm a crime victim or a witness or someone with a vulnerable immigration status if I know that that's also going to be on a body camera that may be used in ways that are out of my control? Minimization is a great principle, right? Don't collect it if you don't need it. Be conscious about what's collected and why, who it's disseminated to, when the data goes away. Community input is key, right? So we skip the step often of having community values articulated around how we want technology to be used. They are clearly different, right? I think a good example is our Seattle surveillance ordinance was received completely differently from New York City's surveillance ordinance, right? So there was a huge outcry over there because I think public trust is less at the center of their policing model, whereas in Seattle, where public trust I think is more central, the ordinance was received much better. So you want enforcement, you want an equity calculus, and of course, you want to be able to evangelize privacy by design as well. There's more research around quantifying the bias, so I think that will hopefully help. Building coalitions is something we're doing a ton of, right? So everyone that we work with is slowly starting to wake up to this idea that this is going to change the game for their specific issue area. And once they do that, of course, they can help be our force multiplier that can help carry our message around why we need to articulate a framework around technology rather than blindly adopting the technology. I like these organizations. You might too. Think about joining them. And then, there's many that are skeptical about the role of legislation, but I actually think legislation, and of course I'm biased because I used to be the ACLU's legislative director, right? But there is definitely a role for legislation and regulation here. I happen to think that we have more leverage where government is involved because government is then able to say, look, if you want to do business with us, here's the level of transparency and ethics that you need to be able to adhere to and place careful restrictions via policy and statute on where the data goes. And we've had, again, some good successes both at the Washington state level and at the local level. The most recent one was our Seattle surveillance ordinance. Does exactly what I just said, which is articulate the purpose of the technology, tell us whether it works to do that, tell us the impact on civil liberties, bring all that information to the city council, have the city council decide, not the way it usually happens, right, which is that some detective, not even someone at the head of a police agency, gets marketed to and they say, hey, this is free technology or cheap, let's just throw it out there and see what happens. And that gives you a vehicle to have that discussion around community values. So the private sector is where those of you all in the private sector come in. I think this is the biggest struggle because, again, the conversation is so diffuse. I've been having these conversations within Facebook, within Google, Amazon, and Microsoft. I think the intentions are good, right? These companies are not used to being considered bad actors. But the challenge is that most of them do seem to believe that they can solve the problems of tech with more tech, and there's not necessarily an appreciation that it may take changing the way you build the tech, right? Changing who's building the tech, changing the values that underlie the tech, because you have to recognize, I think, that the tech is not neutral, right? There's always a choice that's reflected in the way technology comes out. So folks, I'm going to stop there, and I think we've got about 15 minutes for some Q&A if you have any. Thank
you. Over here. Hi, Kevin Kane, Microsoft Research. Let me rewind a bit before all the criminal law stuff and get back to civil issues. I want to ask you to predict what legislation might come, but the Fair Credit Reporting Act in the United States applies to private businesses like credit reporting agencies, and there are other companies that are data brokers that try to say, you should not use this information to make credit decisions or employment decisions, all this stuff, it seems like they're trying to get around being applicable, being subject to the FCRA. Just because they say it doesn't mean it's true. Do you have any sense of whether or not existing legislation like that might come to bear on these companies and be included in their purview?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think, FCRA is a great idea, right? But the application of it has always been the challenge. So my feeling is that we and other organizations trying to sort of fight this fight have looked at vehicles like FCRA. I don't think that we anticipate that Congress is likely to strengthen or even by regulation to apply. We generally think that the regulatory bodies have been subject to agency capture, right, which makes it very difficult for them to actually do anything meaningful in the space. I do think state analogs of things like FCRA, to the extent that they're not preempted, can actually step into that space and make explicit, actually, that not only can you not make credit decisions on the basis of those prohibited factors, but that if a tool is used to extend credit, that those factors, that its decision-making factors should be made transparent. And actually, I think that that's sort of where the action is, right? So legislation that says if you want to play in the state space, you have to give up and open up some of the black box, right? Some of your right to secrecy in your technology to give us an idea of what the decision-making basis is. This is also, I think, sort of embodied in the GDPR a little bit, right? So the new European data regulation that essentially says you have hopefully some right to explanation of what the decision-making basis of a given tool is.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Rachel Greenstadt, Drexel University. So you've spoken a little bit about the public sector and the private sector. Lots of us are academics, obviously, in the research community. You've spoken a little bit about quantifying bias, but I'm wondering what from your perspective, what are the research questions that the privacy and security research community are sort of pressing that you'd love to see us writing papers about?
Boy, I mean, it's such an open field right now, right? I don't know if you're familiar with AI Now. So this is an initiative that Kate Crawford and Meredith Whitaker, who have associations with tech companies but are also academics, and I think are recognized as among the foremost researchers in the AI field. They put this group together that essentially, and now with the ACLU support, I should add, so I have a bias towards their approach. But they outline basically these 8 different areas in which you see problems around how AI is being deployed. And I think they broadly mirror some of the things that I put in my presentation, right? So even being able to create a code of ethics around AI, right, to me, would be a great step one, because then it helps get you closer to addressing some of the other issues in terms of who builds the tool, surfacing at the front end the impacts that it's going to have on communities. I think the toughest thing about AI, though, is what I mentioned about machine learning, which is the bias is a moving target, right? That you can't, if you quantify bias, right, there are a lot of people who are actually trying to crack open the black box around these tools, right? We are actually in litigation, for example, in that Wisconsin case around the predictive sentencing tool that Compass is using. But even if we win that case, all we really get is the right to research. And my feeling is that the onus needs to go back on the entities that are building the tools, which is why I think developing that code of AI for those entities and then applying some public pressure to get them to actually follow it would be really useful. The other piece that I think would be really helpful is actually just an index of transparency around what data you can make public and available about a given AI tool, so that a public decision-making body could take that information and incorporate it into a decision as to whether that body is going to adopt the technology or not.
Thanks.
Does that help?
Somewhat.
David Kohlbrenner, UC San Diego. So this is actually somewhat related to kind of all of that discussion. Early on, you showed a picture of the Tay chatbot that went slightly south, as we all remember. And I think that actually embodies an interesting kind of problem, which is that there are sets of tools and there are sets of things, especially in the AI and machine learning space, that are not kind of fall under the purview of federal or even state regulation, because there are things like chatbots and whatnot. And the data that they're often trained on is not data that the developers are necessarily aware of. Like, it's not, they put them out into the wild and they're trained. And the public has a set of biases that then get encoded into those. How should we think about talking to the engineering and the development of these so that we don't see them exhibit these kind of worst aspects of humanity when they go out there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's growing scholarship on the best way to do that. I would say there's not really consensus on the best way to do that. There's a couple of really good papers that I can refer you to, but I think the idea behind them is actually to try to get the people that build the tools to actually articulate a set of values around the tool in the first place, which allows them then to be more proactive about considering which data sets are fed into it. And to me, so much of this depends, right, this idea that, garbage in, garbage out, it seems to repeat itself again and again and again. The predictive policing is probably the most studied one of these, but my guess is that it happens all the time in that AI space. And if you have people building tools with an intent to put only vetted data sets in, right, then you have a better chance of that tool coming out in a better place. But there's a lot of thinking about different ways to root out the bias within AI.
Thank you.
Hey, Kevin Bach, University of Maryland. This is sensitive. You had a lot of really cool and interesting examples throughout your talk of how different public sector things have merged with companies to do like predictive policing, and Palantir came up a lot. I was wondering if you could just comment on how widespread these things are, like nationally. Like beyond just the individual examples, how many police stations are still pushing pencils and paper, and how many are working with companies? Do we know?
Well, I'll tell you that in a study of the 50 largest police departments or survey that was done not that long ago, close to half had actually deployed predictive policing systems, and another 20-odd% were looking at them. So my guess is that everyone who has the resources is probably considering. I think where it gets really challenging is where companies like Palantir start going after smaller and smaller departments, right? And my experience has been actually that often the folks in these departments are not necessarily particularly technologically sophisticated, and so they're not really in the driver's seat anymore. I suspect, for example, in our Stingray case, that's exactly what is happening, right? Because we've asked for all of these records, right? And we've said, hey, do you keep the warrants? Hey, do you know where you used it? Hey, do you know if you complied with the state statute? And basically, they're not even able to say whether the system hooks up to a computer or creates any metadata whatsoever, right? And they may not be lying, right? That the irony is, I think they may actually not know how the system works because it's always operated by, and the strings are really being pulled by the folks at Harris Corporation who are essentially operating these things for and at the behest of the police department. So that sort of narrative where, again, the discretion and the responsibilities of the public actors, are sort of transferred onto actors in a private corporation who are less accountable, seems to hold again and again. And I think what we're also seeing is these systems are being integrated more and more, right? Mm-hmm. So body cameras on the front end, plus facial recognition. Now AI being incorporated into not just the back end, but the body camera itself, right? So Motorola, for example, is working with a startup called Neurala to do exactly that, right? So you don't even have to have the heavy back end of communication between the body camera to get to the result you're trying to get to, plus systems like Mark 43, which is a Palantir competitor, and Palantir. Another example is social media monitoring systems. We did that PDR. We only asked about 40 departments, and we found that about half of them had looked at and had acquired or had at least considered acquiring the systems. I think the marketing has also been very aggressive, right? Because it's really part of the business model to carve out the space of police departments. Once you get them using your products, right, then they're sort of stuck in your family of products. Yeah. One experience in California that I'll end that comment with is that, for agencies trying to leave the Palantir environment once they're in, it's extremely difficult to the point that LA actually had to pool their policing resources together, right? 4 different departments said, well, we're individually not strong enough to negotiate with Palantir, but maybe if we band together, we could actually influence their practices. Wow. no word yet as to whether that's actually worked.
Wow. And then a quick follow-up question to what you just said, if you don't mind. Beyond just what coverage, it's basically my same last question, just asking the other direction. How many police departments are now using different companies, but how diverse is the pool of companies that are doing this? Because I imagine you could probably pretty easily imagine a world where there's just 2 or 3 companies left that are helping run almost every police department.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of aspirants, right? There are a lot of companies like Neurala, for example, that is trying to, speedily deploy one particular technology. My experience has been that they tend to get snapped up pretty quickly, and so a company like a Palantir really does become a behemoth. And I think you're right that in California, right, policing and Palantir have almost become synonymous in some ways, and a lot of that public discretion has been transferred to one entity, again, without the same oversight that a public entity would have.
Wow, thank you.
Scott Housley with the science and tech piece of DHS, so I guess that makes me kind of the enemy. This whole field, before your talk, we've got challenges all over the place trying to better train, educate, kids all the way to geriatrics, designers, users, the whole thing. Have you thought at all or talked at all at the ACLU about essentially how to retrain police officers and officials with badges that use tools like this? Because there's no reason the heuristics that have been used in decades past are necessarily the same ones that need to be used now, and they're not likely to change quickly or naturally. Have you thought about it as a retraining and a limitations problem?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think there's also an internal structural barrier that prevents some of the kind of change in thinking that I think you're talking about, which is that often the person at the head of the organization is not necessarily a person in control of the technology, right? So we have, I can think of more than one instance, Seattle included, where the police chief will talk a really great game, right? And will say, we want transparency, we want accountability, we want all these things, make it happen. And then you go to the CTO or another person in the agency that's really tasked with acquiring technology, or often an individual detective, because believe it or not, that's often where the level at which these acquisitions happen. Some specific person gets marketed to by, say, Geophidia, right? And they'll keep persistently dangling the hook until someone in the organization bites. And when it happens that way, I think it's very difficult to kind of enforce the same values that the police chief is talking about around every single acquisition. So I think some of it could be in legislation like the surveillance ordinance, which sets out a front-end process. Some of it, I think, is probably in organizational culture. And we have had the experience of working with a police department around a consent decree, which, again, was not specifically about this issue, but was about organizational cultural change, right? So how do you shift the mentality to community policing? I think in that same way, we can incorporate principles about responsible community-centric use of technology that actually is for a measurable public safety benefit that has been weighed against a civil liberties cost.
Hi, Roland Frasek, University of Twente in the Netherlands. What strikes me about, great presentation by the way, what strikes me about these presentations is if you see it from a US or a North American perspective, that what strikes me is that the legislation seems to be very specific to certain breaches of privacy or certain civil liberties, whereas on the other side of the Atlantic, there's now the GDPR, which sort of regulates everything from the get-go, but there are no real individual things that are getting regulated. And you say that you are sort of a fan of regulating these kinds of things correctly, and I'm wondering, what is your take? What is better, doing it all sort of top-down as they're doing in Europe, or taking the specific cases and regulating them well, but more specifically that you seem to be taking in North America?
Yeah, boy, that is such a complicated conversation because
I'm sorry.
It's obviously, to sort of provide a short opinion on that. I've had experience at every level of the system, right? I've been a federal lobbyist, I've been a state lobbyist, I've been a local lobbyist. I think, just as a very practical matter for the reasons I mentioned earlier, it's really difficult to get anything top down right now in the U.S., right? I think it's a challenge to get around the amount of money that's flying around Congress lobbying against regulation of these technologies right now. At the state level, we've had more luck. There's less money flying around the states, although there is quite a lot. But I do think you can build really interesting coalitions of people. We've been very successful in getting libertarian Republicans and sort of progressive Democrats to come together and actually push privacy statutes that are statewide. And ideally, what I think I would like is statewide statutes that are both tech neutral and tech specific, right? So we've taken some runs at, for example, something called the Washington Enhanced Intelligence Act, which is about what kind of predicate you use to collect information, and also tech-specific things like body cameras, right? We would like a statewide floor for something like that so that the public can have trust as they go from jurisdiction to jurisdiction as to what is going to happen with the data. But then communities can choose to go above that floor, right, and have this, what I think is a really critical, local-centric community discussion around what are our values, how do we think civil liberties ought to be protected, is having body cameras at all a step too far, for example, right? So I don't think we should lose the robustness of those public debates because we're also trying to do this top-down. I think they can coexist.
Okay, thank you.
Last question, I think.
Okay. Malekman Salem, Accenture. A lot of the AI-based services are sold as services based on the outcome, right? So you charge the client based on the outcome. Do you have an idea about how Palantir is selling its services? Is it product-based or is it as a service? And if so, do they charge based on the correctly predicted crimes or based on the number of queries that a police officer might issue?
There's a really great research paper specifically on Palantir's business model, and I think the short of it essentially is that there are heavy discounts on the front end. You sort of pay for value-added services, but then what keeps you in the loop is the benefits of more and more other agencies joining. Because Palantir's model basically is they get all this data in the door that's not publicly accessible, right? So there's this idea of de-siloing all of this stuff from local, state, and federal level into one space that forms the basis of these predictive metrics. That's what they're trying to do. And so, as I said, I think the challenge is it costs you more and more as a police agency to opt out of that. I think the unspoken problem with that, of course, is that it's not really predictive, right? It should be called forecasting. It should not be called prediction because it's not necessarily particularly accurate. If it's based on more and more bad data, the predictions also get worse and worse. So I can refer you to that paper, which is a really interesting read.
That'd be great.
So we did go a few minutes over, just not surprising given the quality of that talk. So let's go ahead and thank the speaker one last time, please.
Thank you.